This being the home of two of Pieter Bruegel the eldest's smallest pictures, I thought we might just talk a little bit about how you go about finding Pieter Bruegel, spelt wrong you'll notice, his biggest painting. And that's the wine of St. Martin's Day. Now, it's not only dealers and auction houses that discover pictures, sometimes museum people do as well. And this really arose because a certain duchess in the south of Spain was about to be married and needed to realise some cash. And so offered to the Prado a picture in her collection. I was working there as deputy director, and I went down to Córdoba to have a look at the picture that she was offering, which was a very fine picture, but not one that the Prado needed. We had about 300 paintings by Goya already. But in the proverbial dark corridor was this picture here. That's sort of life-size, 270 across, very large picture, difficult to see where it was hung, but when one went to look close up, one or two details struck me as being actually rather good and deserving of further study. Now, the composition of this picture was known. That's the detail that I'm referring to there. I was particularly struck by that head there. It seemed really very, very high quality, because the usual thing is to find, as I say the usual thing, it's more common, let's say, to find a copy, a 16th century copy perhaps, or even later, and by some other member of the Bruegel family, of a painting made by Pieter Bruegel the elder. But certainly here there seemed to be some special quality to the picture that made it seem rather better than a copy. But anyway, the picture was known from some other versions of it. Here in the Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum, this is a slide you can see on screen, you can see a fragment of the detail of St. Martin, who appears there on the right. He's dividing his cloak for the poor people who appear immediately to his left and to his right. But especially, of course, this is the version of the composition that was best known, this print, which is a print that was commissioned by Abraham Bruegel. Abraham Bruegel was the great-grandson of Pieter Bruegel the elder. The amazing thing is, if you read the inscription, you'll find that he attributes the invention of that composition not to his great-grandfather, Pieter Bruegel the elder, but to his grandfather, Jan Bruegel, or Velvet Bruegel. So even in the family, it seems, there was some confusion as to who that composition had actually been invented by. Now, the very interesting thing that we did immediately was to compare the detail, the relevant detail in the painting that we'd found in Córdoba with the fragment in Vienna, and it became immediately apparent that here was something that was rather more interesting, more intriguing. It seemed to be certainly of higher quality, and it even had one or two changes in the composition, which is exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to determine, as you all know, whether something is an original invention or if it's no more than a copy. So the qualitative aspect, the quality aspect of the picture was tremendously important in determining that it deserved much more investigation. So there's one of the changes that was apparent to the eye. You didn't need an X-ray machine in order to identify it. It's perfectly clear there. There was a second hoof there by the first one. And if you look carefully, you can just make out that there's a slight change in the profile of the rear hindquarters, the rear leg of the horse. Now, you could say, well, they're just slight modifications rather than proper changes. But there were one or two other examples in the picture that made this one particularly interesting. And I point out another one here, which is the great red barrel that appears in the center of the picture. You can just make out that this figure here actually runs beneath the red barrel. So that's exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to identify a picture which is an original invention rather than a copy. So clearly the artist is thinking through the composition and making changes as he works in it. So all these things were extremely, extremely promising. Now, the problem with the picture was that it was not in very good condition. The technique of this painting is glue-sized tempera on canvas. We sometimes refer to it as tuchlein. It's a rather dry medium. It ends up looking a little bit like a fresco. The problem with it, and with many Zucklines that have survived down to our day, and there aren't that many of them, is that almost invariably they've been varnished subsequently to when they were painted. They weren't intended to be varnished by the artists who painted them, but subsequently in their history, partly because they have a rather pale appearance, and so by varnishing them, the colour ends up looking more saturated and the image more readable. The other thing is it had also been lined from the back, so the glue that had been used for lining had pushed through to the front, and the varnish which had been placed on the front had pushed through to the back, so it was sandwiched between two liquids, which it certainly wasn't meant to have from the beginning. And that meant that the readability of the picture was very affected. In fact, there came a moment when the picture was with the conservation studio in the Prado that we thought that it may not be possible to do very much to improve its appearance. And indeed, the orthodoxy up to that point was that a Zucklein that has been varnished is almost irretrievable. But in fact, that turned out not to be the case, although it's certainly the case that it's not as readable as it should have been. Here's a fragment of the landscape that you see over to the left, the city gate with the little figures walking in and out. There's a village here, and very, very difficult to make out. Here's a marine view with some little boats. When you actually see that in X-ray, you become aware of just how much detail there actually was on the surface. It still is there, it's just not visible anymore. Much of it's not visible anymore, but certainly there was a huge amount of careful detail, and you can see the tiny boats here in the marine view, and you can certainly make out quite a lot more with those little figures who are walking in and out of the city gate. Now, most of Bruegel's pictures are painted on panel, in oil on panel. There are very, very few which are painted in glue-sized tempera on canvas, but there are two which are very, very beautifully preserved, and they're both in Naples, in Capodimonte. This is one of them, the Parable of the Blind Leading the Blind, and this is a magnificently preserved Zucklein. It appears in Parma already in the 16th century and stays pretty much in the same collection down to when it enters the National Museum in Naples. So this is beautifully preserved. And if you look at some of the details of that picture, this gives you an idea of what a Zucklein by Bruegel would have looked like without being sandwiched between varnish and glue. And one of the very interesting things that emerges here is this hatching and cross-hatching that he uses certainly very, very clearly in his glue-sized tempera pictures, not so much in his oil paintings. And you can see there the detail of the white hatching appearing there. Here, there's some hatching in the headgear of the blind man there. So we were certainly looking for that sort of detail in the large picture that we had in the studio. And sure enough, it took a little while to find it, particularly because the picture was so dirty and so compromised by it being varnished that it was very difficult to see these sorts of details. But eventually, here's a woman who's putting her child on the good road, drinking very young, as you can see. But there, in the detail of her jacket, you can see just the sorts of handiwork, and I mean that very literally, of Bruegel as he was executing this picture. The other thing that was really desirable was a signature. Because Bruegel, in fact, signed most of his pictures, and particularly his late pictures in the 1560s, they're almost all signed. Well, I thought a picture of this scale certainly should have a signature on it. So I told the restorer who was working on the picture, I said, look, you really need to look very hard, particularly around the corners at the bottom, and it may well be that at some point during your cleaning, you will find a signature. So she worked and worked, and no signature emerged, until one day I was taking a Café con Leche around the corner from the Prado, and I got a phone call on my mobile from Elisa Mora, the restorer, to say, Gabriele, you must come down right now because we found the signature on the picture. So having removed a bit of overpaint, which was in this area at the bottom left of the picture, just below that inventory number, which was perfectly visible even when the picture was dirty, had emerged the signature. Now you can hardly see it here, but there's a B and there's an R and there's an E. And once again, we need to turn to technology to get a much better reading of the picture and of the signature. And so there, underneath the 31, which is perfectly clear and legible, you can make out the Latin script, the capital letters which make up his name, B-R-U. Here it gets much more difficult to see what it is, you can imagine it. And then beneath that, a date, so M.D. And an L, so it's 1550, possibly an X, so into 60s. Almost certainly, we think, comparing with his other dated works, a picture from the mid-1560s. He dies only a few years later. But I have to say, by this stage, we were very confident about the attribution of the picture. And in fact, we'd struck a deal with the Duchess that if we cleaned the picture and felt that it was in good enough condition to be able to acquire for the National Spanish Collection, and if we were satisfied with the attribution of the picture, that we really did think it was by Pieter Bruegel the Elder rather than a later repetition or a later copy, then we would acquire it. If we didn't, then we would return it to her, having been restored. And very cleverly, we fixed the price before we began the conservation treatment. So she was committed, and we were committed only to the cleaning, nothing more than that. So I'm delighted that it all worked out, and I want to pay tribute to one of my teachers here at the Courtauld, Lorne Campbell. Some of you may remember him. Lorne Campbell came over to Madrid, and it was perfectly appropriate for us to bring in experts from outside to help create a consensus around the importance and the attribution of the picture. And Lorne was one of those who came to visit us. Here are some comparisons with other signatures by Bruegel, the Elder, and everything falls very nicely into place. Here are some of the details after the cleaning. Now, this didn't turn this into a pristine, brand new picture. This is a damaged picture, but it's a very, very important picture. I say it's Bruegel's largest painting. There are more than 100 figures in it. It's a huge operation. It's a great work of invention. There's a huge amount of wit and humour in it. This is the drawing of the first wine of the season on the feast day of St. Martin, the 11th of November, the Nouveau Beaujolais, as it were, which is pouring out of the vat, and all these peasants are trying their hardest to get some of it in any sort of vessel that you can see, broken pots and metal containers, and even a shoe. What that would do to the taste of the wine, I have no idea. Probably disgusting. But anyway, here's another fabulous detail, which is this man who's clambering up onto the scaffolding, holding the vat and reaching across to try and get some wine himself, with these beautiful highlights, zigzag highlights painted on. And even here, you can see it's a damaged piece of painting, but it is absolutely fabulous. And they're going even further into the picture, one of those beautiful details of the heads with the tiny flecks of white, all of which are absolutely typical characteristics of Pieter Bruegel the Elder, whether he's working in oil, in glue-sized tempera, on panel, or indeed on canvas. Wonderful detail on the left, this guy who's completely blottoed, with that handprint on his back. That's actually a mark. That's a mark of in the city of Brussels when clothes were distributed to poor people, so they wouldn't sell them on. They put a hand mark on them, so it's a real sort of hand-me-down. And couple of guys fighting after the drinking, a bit like Catford on a Saturday night where I live. So the effects of wine, it's a sort of triptych in a way. So on in the middle, you have this mad scrambling for wine from the vat. On the right, you have St. Martin sort of turning his back on the things that are being done in his name on St. Martin's Day, sharing his cloak with these poor people to left and right. And then on the left, you have the effects of wine. So the cleaning was remarkably effective. It really restored to a situation where we could actually understand and appreciate the extraordinary qualities of the picture. And because of that special arrangement with the Duchess and the Spanish states stepping in to enable us to acquire it, Bruegel's biggest picture is now in the public collection of the Prado. Thank you very much.